If you turn to Matthew chapter 26, you'll remember that last week the Lord, face to face with his adversary Caiaphas, he was asked the question as to whether he was the Christ, the Son of God. And not just a question, but Caiaphas had adjured him. And when it says in Matthew 26 and verse 63, the word adjure, the only time it's here now mentioned in the New Testament, it means to exact an answer by an oath. And so bound, the Lord would have been having to answer this question because silence would have meant the pain of death. So how would Jesus answer this question as to whether he was the Christ, the Son of God? Well, in verse 64, he said to Caiaphas, "Thou hast said, but nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." And you see, Caiaphas wanted to know who Jesus was. He wanted to know his identity. He wanted to know who his father was. In essence, Caiaphas wanted to know the lineage of Jesus. And so if you come with me to Psalm 110, which is where Jesus had quoted from, you could get no better answer, really, than to quote Psalm 110. But Jesus was quoting this to Caiaphas, who was the high priest in Israel that year. And so with that in mind, we read in Psalm 110, verse 1, "The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. For the Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion, and rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. Thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power, in the beauties of holiness. From the womb of the morning, thou hast the dew of thy youth." And notice verse 4 of Psalm 110. "The Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou, my son, art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." And you see, Caiaphas wanted to know who Jesus was. Jesus quoted Psalm 110 and said, "Caiaphas, this is who I am. I am without father, I am without mother, I am without descent. I have neither beginning of days nor end of life, but I am made like unto the Son of God, and I abide a priest continually." Of course, that's quoting Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 3, which the Apostle Paul picked up. But brothers and sisters, imagine that you're the Lord Jesus Christ reverently for one moment, and you have just said that this Psalm 110, applies to me. And Caiaphas, your high priesthood will end. But my high priesthood is only about to begin. You see, when you consider the contrast between what the Lord has just quoted to Caiaphas, you think about these connections, brothers and sisters, from what Jesus said to Caiaphas and what is there found in Psalm 110. You see, Jesus acknowledged what Caiaphas had said to him, just as God affirmed what he had said in Psalm 110 to David's Lord. Jesus accepted that he would sit at God's right hand, just as God in Psalm 110 attested that his Son would sit at his. Jesus alluded to the great power of the Son of Man, just as in Psalm 110 God had appointed the Son of Man a day of power. And Jesus assured his adversary Caiaphas of his position by an oath, just as God in Psalm 110 avowed and had sworn that there would come a greater high priest. And if you come back to Matthew chapter 26, you see Jesus was not just a greater high priest. He was going to be the head of a greater high priesthood. And Jesus' high priesthood was only now about to begin, and therefore Caiaphas' high priesthood was coming to an end. And you see, when you come back to Matthew chapter 26, how could any high priest still serve without his garments? Because in verse 65 of Matthew 26, "Then the high priest rent his clothes." And you see in verse 65 of Matthew chapter 26, Caiaphas, in a symbol in this act, had rent his garments, which was hard to do. The law in Exodus 39 said that this was nigh impossible to do. It was so woven tightly. But Caiaphas had rent his garments. And he said in verse 65 that Jesus had spoken blasphemy. And in this very act, the high priest that year, Caiaphas, had ceased to wear the mantle of the office. You see, brothers and sisters, I suggest to you that when the Lord quoted Psalm 110 to Caiaphas, Caiaphas knew every word and every line of that psalm. And so the charge that he laid to the Sanhedrin that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy, and therefore, verse 66, guilty of death, this quote from the Lord's mouth had made this battle between these two men ever so personal. But Caiaphas had one problem, because he could have, with the Sanhedrin, taken Jesus, they thrust him out, and they could have stoned him. They had the ability to do such thing. But you see, Caiaphas' problem is he didn't want Jesus to die by stoning. No, that would be no good. It would only be a half measure. And so Caiaphas was going to need the assistance of Pontius Pilate. Now, if you come with me to John chapter 18, this is going to make up the bulk of our class this morning, as we now consider that Caiaphas is going to have to enlist the assistance of Pontius Pilate. And in John chapter 18, it says in verse 28 that after the events of Matthew 26, verse 28 of John 18 says, "Then led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover." And so where did they lead the Lord Jesus Christ? Well, if you look here on the screen, this is believed where the judgment hall was located in Jerusalem, a magnificent building. And this was where Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, would have resided when he had come up to Jerusalem for the feast. You see this magnificent building there on the west side of Jerusalem. And in fact, Unger's Bible Dictionary gives us a few more details of this judgment hall, which was known as the Praetorium. Now he says, speaking of the word there in John 18, verse 28, judgment hall, he says this. He says, it denotes, 1, the headquarters in a Roman camp, or the tent of the commander-in-chief. But for our purposes in Jerusalem, number 2, the palace in which the governor or procurator of a province resided. At Jerusalem, it was the magnificent palace which Herod the Great built for himself, and which the Roman procurators seem to have occupied whenever they came from Caesarea to Jerusalem on public business. And so there in verse 28, where it says the judgment hall, this is the location of which they brought Jesus. Now, what was the business that the Jews, led by Caiaphas, were bringing Jesus to Pontius Pilate? Verse 29, Pilate then went out unto them and said, "What accusation bring you against this man?" And notice how they answer in verse 30. They answered and said unto him, "Well, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee." A malefactor they called Jesus, verse 30. Now that word malefactor, it simply means an evildoer or a criminal. And so you notice when Pontius Pilate comes out unto them, because they wouldn't enter into the judgment hall proper, lest they couldn't partake of the Passover, verse 28. When Pontius Pilate says, "Well, who is this man?" they say, "Well, he's a criminal, or he's an evildoer." And so if he were a criminal, then they actually had, the Jews did, power to execute a judgment upon him. For notice how Pontius Pilate returns in verse 31 of John 18. Then said Pilate unto them, "Well, take ye him and judge him according to your law." For the Jews therefore said unto him, "Oh, it's not lawful for us to put any man to death." And you see, brothers and sisters, that was inaccurate. They did have jurisdiction by their own law, the Jews did, to put a man to death. But it was only to put a man to death by stoning. And you see, the Jewish powers, they didn't want to put Jesus to death by stoning. They wanted to put him to death a very specific way, and for a very specific reason. Now, if you leave something in John 18, and just come with me all the way back to Deuteronomy 21, this is why they needed the assistance of Pontius Pilate. Because for Jesus, they had a very specific method of execution in mind, very specific. And here it is in Deuteronomy chapter 21. You see in verse 22 there's this small little section about a capital punishment and the curse that came with it. And this is what Caiaphas wanted for Jesus. Deuteronomy 21, verse 22. It says, "If a man hath committed a sin worthy of death, and he be to be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree," verse 23 of Deuteronomy 21, "his body shall not remain all night upon the tree. But thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance." And you see, this was a very specific way in which Caiaphas wanted Jesus to die. He wanted Jesus to die the death of a cross. Now, Brother H.P. Mansfield has this wonderful comment in his Story of the Bible, Volume 7. He says, speaking of what was Caiaphas' intention with Jesus, "This would have meant execution by stoning if they had judged him according to their law. But such a death as that would have defeated the purpose of the Jewish leaders. It could have been discounted as either a miscarriage of justice by the friends of Jesus. No, they wanted such as a death that would make it obvious to all that Jesus was not the Christ. Death on the cross, the Roman form of execution alone, would accomplish that, for the law cursed anybody who died in such a manner." And you see, Caiaphas knew that in Jesus' life, he had received the blessings of the law, for he had kept it. But Caiaphas also knew that if he could put Jesus upon the cross, then in his death, he'd be cursed. And so Caiaphas needed to orchestrate this death through the one who could give this death, and that was Pontius Pilate. And so what we're going to see this morning, God willing, brothers and sisters, is Caiaphas is going to be at the mercy of Pontius Pilate and his attitude, his custom, and his words. Now let's examine the attitude of Pontius Pilate. If you come back to the New Testament with me to Luke chapter 23, and we come back in, pick up the story, as Caiaphas and the Jewish leaders have led Jesus to this judgment hall. In Luke 23, we learn that though they had called Jesus a criminal, we learn what they said was his crime. Now in Luke chapter 23, which is Luke's account of the events of this trial before Pontius Pilate, it says in verse 1, that the whole multitude of them arose and led Jesus unto Pilate. And in verse 2, we get the charge or the crime of which Jesus had committed in their eyes. And in verse 2 of Luke 23, it says, "And they began to accuse Jesus, saying, This fellow, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king." Now it's worth noting that in verse 2, these were very carefully crafted charges of which they brought to Pilate's ears in verse 2. And you can't help but notice that they're sort of demarcated in a dual aspect. So there's sort of like two parts to them, and they served each a purpose. So in verse 2 of Luke 23, when they began to accuse him, they said, verse 2, "We found this fellow perverting the nation." Now what nation was that? Well, that was the nation of Israel. And so this would have roused sort of suspicion amongst the Jews. He's perverting the nation of Israel. But notice also in verse 2, he's forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. And so this would have roused in the ears of the listeners the Romans. As you notice, these two aspects that are here in verse 2 is very craftily considered, that the charges are brought. He's perverting the nation, that would have roused the Jewish individuals, and he's forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. So that would have roused in the ears of the Romans. And furthermore, in verse 2, you see what it says at the end. He says that he himself is Christ. Well, certainly that would have roused in the ears of the Jewish people. And lastly, at the end of verse 2, a king. Oh, that would have roused in the ears of the Romans. You see how these charges are very craftily laid out in the ears of Pontius Pilate. There with the multitude, every individual listening would have had invested interest in the outcome of this Gentile trial. Because he's perverting the nation, and he's the Christ, well, that's Jewish. If he's forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, and he's a king, well, that's Roman. And that's how crafty Caiaphas was when he brought these charges and had the right focus there in the ears of the multitude that was there listening and seeing the outcome of this Gentile trial. And so Caiaphas needed to rouse the interest of Pontius Pilate, and he did, because in verse 3, you notice what it says of Luke 23, and Pilate asked Jesus, saying, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And I suggest to you, brothers and sisters, that it's worth reading verse 3 with a tone of incredulity or skepticism. You can just imagine that Pilate comes out now meeting Jesus, perhaps for the first time. He says, "Art thou the king of the Jews? You?" In fact, the Young's literal translation renders verse 3 this way: "Thou art the king of the Jews?" And so it sort of turns the verse a little bit. And you can just imagine that Pilate comes out and says, "You're the king of the Jews?" And this is exactly what Caiaphas does not want to happen. He doesn't want Pilate to have any seed of doubt which could arise in his mind, that he might turn away this trial. Caiaphas desperately wants Pilate to bring it to his own logical end and put Jesus upon a cross. And notice how Jesus responds in verse 3. "And Jesus answered Pilate and said, Thou sayest it." Or in other words, "It is as you say." And you see, in Pilate's mind, when you are presented to a king, you see, kings command, they're not commanded. Kings compel, they're not compelled. But this man, Jesus, had been brought to Pilate, and all he had been doing has been led. Kings are not led. Take, for example, brothers and sisters, Luke 22 and verse 54. It says, "And they took Jesus and led him and brought him into the high priest's house." Luke 22 and verse 54. Take, for example, Luke 22 and verse 66. "As soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led Jesus to their council." And here now a third time in Luke 23 and verse 1, "And the whole multitude of them arose and led Jesus unto Pilate." And so Luke 22 verse 54, Luke 22 and verse 66, and Luke 23 and verse 1, 3 times we are being told that Jesus is led somewhere. Kings are not led. Kings do not look weary and perhaps bloodied, and certainly they're not bound in chains. And so as Jesus stood in the judgment hall and the Jewish multitude accused him with their words, Pilate had a very specific response. In fact, he wondered as to who this man was before him. And if you come over to Matthew chapter 27, this is actually Pilate's response as to who he had in front of him. The accusation, amongst other things, was that he was a king, but this is how Pilate responded, at least in his own mind. So when you come to Matthew chapter 27, this is what we find in terms of Pilate's response. It says in verse 12 of Matthew 27, it says that when Jesus was accused of the chief priests and elders, Jesus answered nothing. Verse 13 of Matthew 27. "Then said Pilate unto him, Hearest thou how many things they witness against thee? And verse 14 says that Jesus answered him never a word. And here's how Pilate responded. Insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Now that word marveled in verse 14, it means to wonder. And to sort of help us appreciate the thrust of this word, if you come with me to the book of Acts, and come with me to Acts chapter 7, the same word is found in Acts chapter 7. This word marvel that Pilate was feeling when presented with the presence of Jesus. So if you come with me to Acts chapter 7, you'll recall this is the speech of Stephen. And in this section of his speech, in verse 31, he's dealing with Moses as he approached the burning bush. And here's what Stephen says in Acts chapter 7. It says, "And when Moses saw the burning bush," verse 31 of Acts 7, "Moses wondered," and that's our word, marveled, in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 14. Moses marveled or wondered at the sight. And as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him. You see, when Moses drew near to the burning bush, what was Moses' response? Moses was seeing something which defied all logic. Because Moses was seeing this bush on fire, and his response, Moses' response at least, was, why is it not burning? And so when Pilate is now presented with the Lord Jesus Christ, and they're saying that he is proclaiming to be a king, it defies all logic. And so if you come back with me to John chapter 18, now having considered Pilate's response in terms of his attitude as to what he's seeing, this is sort of starting off on the wrong foot in terms of how Caiaphas is hoping that this will result. And so when you come back to John chapter 18, with Pilate now wondering, it says in verse 35 that Pilate then says to Jesus, "Am I a Jew?" Jesus says that when Pilate asked if he was a king, he says, "As thou sayest it," or "if you say so." And Pilate in verse 35 of John 18 says to Jesus, "Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me." And you see, Pilate was now trying to determine what was Jesus' crime. If he had not said anything that was worthy of death, well, perhaps Jesus had done something. Because at the end of verse 35, you notice Pilate's next question to Jesus. He said to him, "What hast thou done?" You see, the accusations that the chief priests and Caiaphas had brought to Pilate's ears was that Jesus was saying this, he was perverting the nation. Jesus was saying that, don't give tribute to Caesar. But perhaps Jesus and his crime lay not in what he had said, but perhaps in what he had done. And it's very fascinating to also note, but Pilate was giving Jesus an opportunity under Roman law to defend himself. And there's actually a Roman law that existed in this time, and there's a book that I have at home. It's called Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. And it has this, speaking about if a charge was laid in the Roman court, that the defendant had an opportunity 3 times to defend himself. Now here's what it says on page 24 and 25. It says, "In practice, there must not be more than 2 or 3 spokesmen. The charge was to be clearly indicated, not as a charge against a particular Roman law, but as a charge of particular undesirable actions on which Pilate is asked to adjudicate. The accusers are to allege the facts, and the judge decides what to make of them. Those who did not defend themselves were given 3 opportunities of changing their minds before sentence was finally given against them." And so we've had Caiaphas bring the facts in the accusation. Pilate is trying to make sense of what they mean. And this Roman law, the law regarding opportunity to answer, was going to give the defendant, Jesus, 3 opportunities to defend himself. And so given the chance to have the ear of the Roman governor, how would Jesus respond? Well, in verse 36 of John 18, notice how Jesus would respond when he has the undivided attention of the governor of Judea. Verse 36 of John 18. "And Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. For if my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from hence." And you can't help but notice that 3 times in verse 36, Jesus references his kingdom. He says, "My kingdom, my kingdom, my kingdom," in verse 36, 3 times. And in fact, brothers and sisters, if you like to trace them through, that in this little section from John 18 and John 19, the word king comes up 12 times in this section. And this is going to be the thrust of what Jesus has to say to Pontius Pilate. That yes, I am a king, but my kingdom is different. Different, Pilate, from any kingdom you've ever known. And notice how Pilate responds. This is the only way he could have responded, verse 37 of John 18. And Pilate therefore said unto Jesus, Art thou a king then? So you are a king, is how Pilate responds in verse 37. But you see, Pilate could only think in terms of literal terms. He couldn't think in terms of spiritual terms. He couldn't think in terms that Jesus' kingdom would be a future kingdom. And so when Jesus spoke about that kingdom, Pilate could not discern the spiritual depth of what Jesus was saying. So much so that in verse 37, that's how Pilate responds. Then you are a king. But Pilate was only thinking physical and not spiritual. And there's a very specific reason why Pilate couldn't lift his thinking to the spiritual content of what Jesus was saying. And that is because he didn't hear the voice of truth. Because in verse 37, after Pilate had asked Jesus, Thou art a king then, Jesus answered, verse 37 of John 18, Thou sayest that I am a king. But to this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. For every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. And you see, this is what Jesus was saying to Pontius Pilate, and Brother Robert Roberts has this wonderful comment in his Nazareth Revisited about what Jesus had just said to Pilate in verse 37. He said, this was the truth. That Jesus might bear witness to the truth was the very object of the present appearance among the Jews. And then, as reflecting on the attitude of the chief priests, he added, every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. If they had been of the truth, they would not have been his accusers and calumniators. This excited a momentary curiosity in Pilate, for what could this truth be which Jesus made so prominent? He would ask him, well, what is truth? But Pilate did not stay to get an answer. He had no earnest solitude on the point one way or another. And you notice how Pilate responds in verse 38. Pilate said unto Jesus, well, what is truth? Now, I don't know how you read this, brothers and sisters, in verse 38, but I tend to read it that when Pilate responded to Jesus' comment about that he was the witness of the truth, I sort of read in verse 38 that Pilate had a sense of cynicism or skepticism. What is truth? I don't believe that he was sincere in his question. And the reason why I don't believe that is because in verse 38 also, and when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews. And Robert Roberts makes the point that though Pilate asked the question, didn't care to hear the answer. And if we're not able to hear the truth, then no one can tell it to us. If our mind is so closed that we won't hear the truth, then no one will be successful in telling it to us. And we think in our own experiences where we have sort of an interested friend, perhaps an acquaintance, we have some inroads that are laid, and we share with them a few components of the truth. And where do we get to? Well, we hit some sort of personal roadblock that they've built. And that's it. And they won't hear the rest of the matter. This would have been Pilate. This would have been the man that Jesus was now being thrust in front of. What is truth? And can you really blame Pilate? Because you had God's people, and he was in the center of that nation, and he saw all the hypocrisy of it. In fact, he saw the whole reason that Jesus had even been brought in front of him. Because if you come with me to Matthew, hold something in John 18, and come back with me to Matthew's account of these events, and come back with me to Matthew chapter 27. Here's the reason, and Pilate knew this, as to why Caiaphas and the chief priests had brought Jesus in front of them. It says in verse 17 of Matthew 27, Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called the Christ? And notice what verse 18 says of Matthew 27. For Pilate knew that for envy they had delivered Jesus. Pilate knew that they were envious of this man of whom they were bringing accusation in front of. Pilate knew that. So when you come back to John chapter 18, and Pilate says, well, what is truth? You have this nation, and look how hypocritical they are. Yet they're the ones of all the people of the earth that profess to know the truth. And so what will Pilate do? Well, here's what he'll do. If you come back to John chapter 18, the Roman law said that the defendant would give 3 opportunities to defend himself. And you know what's fascinating, brothers and sisters? Jesus would not take up those opportunities so much as Pilate would. Because notice what Pilate does 3 times back in John chapter 18. After Pilate says, verse 38, what is truth? That when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said unto them, I find in him no fault at all. So John 18, verse 38, Pilate is going to declare that there's no fault in Jesus at all. John 19, verse 4, Pilate therefore went forth again and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. And finally, a 3rd time in John 19, verse 6, that when the chief priests therefore and officers saw Jesus, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate saith unto them, Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. And in a twist of fate, Pilate actually defends Jesus 3 times. And each of those 3 times, in John 18:38, John 19, verse 4, and John 19, verse 6, Pilate said, I find no fault in him. And the word fault in all 3 times is the same word, and it means a crime worthy of punishment. So when Pilate said to this multitude, I find no crime worthy of punishment, he had defended Jesus 3 times. And even though Caiaphas had brought unto Pilate a supposed criminal, all Pilate saw before him was an innocent man. And so he declared him so. And so now Pilate is going to turn his attention on endeavoring to release Jesus. And if you're Caiaphas, you are seeing this endeavor unraveling before your very eyes. Now Pilate has declared him innocent, not worthy of any crime, worthy of punishment. And now Pilate is going to endeavor to try and release him. And here's how he's going to do it. Verse 39 of John 18, Pilate again says, Ye have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will ye therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? Then cried they all again, saying, No, not this man, but Barabbas. For now Barabbas was a robber. And now into this scene is going to enter this man known as Barabbas. And note at the end of verse 40 that Barabbas was a robber. Now he was not just a robber, but he was known for other infractions. If you come with me to Mark chapter 15, he was known for these other infractions. So John 18 verse 40 tells us that he was a robber, but in Mark's account, we learn a few more details about who this Barabbas was and what he had done. So Mark 15 says in verse 6, Now at that feast, verse 6 of Mark 15, Pilate released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. In verse 7 says that there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, that had made insurrection with him, and who had committed murder in the insurrection. So there's 3 things that we learn about what Barabbas had done, which had been the cause of him being bound in chains. In John chapter 18, verse 40, we learn that he was a robber. In Mark chapter 15, in verse 7, we learn that he had made insurrection. And again in Mark 15, verse 7, we learn that he had murdered. So the 3 things we learn about this man Barabbas was he was a robber, he was a revolter, and he was a murderer. But the most noteworthy thing about this man who stood now next to Jesus as Pilate presented the 2 options as to who to release was perhaps Barabbas' name. If you just come to Matthew chapter 27, Matthew adds this one detail which is extremely peculiar about who this Barabbas was. And it lies in the name of Barabbas. Now here's what it says in Matthew chapter 27. It says in verse 15, "Now at that feast the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would." Matthew 27, verse 16. "And they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together," verse 17 of Matthew 27, "Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ?" Now you notice at the end of verse 17, Pilate puts this little epithet next to Jesus' name. Jesus, which is called Christ. There's almost a way to demarcate Jesus on this side and Barabbas on that side. Now, it's been suggested, and it's a good suggestion, I believe, that Barabbas was probably his last name, not his first name, because Barabbas means son of a father. Bar meaning son, and Abba meaning father. So Barabbas was most likely his last name. He was the son of a father. So then, therefore, what perhaps might have been his first name? Now, it's very fascinating to look, and you can perhaps consider this for homework. But in the net translation of the section here in Matthew 27, verse 15 to 17, here's how it reads, and we focus on the name of Barabbas. It says, Matthew 27, verse 15 to 17 from the Net Bible, "During the feast, the governor was accustomed to release one prisoner to the crowd, whomever they wanted. At that time, they had in custody a notorious prisoner named Jesus Barabbas. And so after they had assembled, Pilate said unto them, Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Christ?" And if this is to be considered, it makes more sense now why Pilate said we have Jesus who is called the Christ on one side and Jesus who is known as Barabbas on the other side. Now, be that as it may, brothers and sisters, what is worth noting is that on each side of Pilate, you had the son of a father. Because you had the Lord Jesus Christ, who was the son of the Father. And on the other side, you had this man, Jesus Barabbas, who was the son of a father. And the crowd had to choose. Which son of a father would they take? Would they take one who was an innocent man in whom was found no cause worthy of death, or would they take a robber or a revolter or a murderer? And if you pause for a moment, brothers and sisters, you think about this crowd. They hated the Romans. They did not want anything to do with the Romans. And one said, my kingdom is one day in the future. And the other said, I'll do anything to get rid of those Romans. It's no wonder that though they were led by Caiaphas and the chief priests, that they wanted the one who was willing to rob and to revolt and to kill if it meant getting rid of the Romans. And only one of them would be set free. Because if you come back to John chapter 19, that's what the word release means that Pilate had said to this crowd. Verse 39 of John 18. Pilate said to them, "You have a custom that I should set free unto you one at the Passover." Because in verse 39 of John 18, that word release, it means to set free. But only one of these men would go free. And so what are you to do if you're Pontius Pilate? How are you supposed to release one of these men into the crowd? One has done nothing worthy of a crime, and one is bound in chains for more crimes than one. And Pilate has to set free just one of them. Which one would he choose? And if you're Caiaphas, you're on pins and needles. because you're desperately endeavoring to move this Gentile trial towards its likely conclusion in your own mind, that Jesus would be put upon a cross. And so in verse 1 of John 19, then Pilate therefore took Jesus and he scourged him. And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. And they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they smote him with their hands. And Pilate therefore, verse 4 of John 19, went forth again and saith unto them, "Behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him." And verse 5 says something ever so peculiar in the light of how Jesus was presented to this crowd. Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate saith unto the multitude, "Behold the man." Now, why is it significant that Jesus was wearing a crown? And why is it significant that he was wearing a robe of purple? And why, brothers and sisters, is it significant that Pilate said unto this multitude, "Behold the man"? God willing, in our final class, we will consider and answer these questions when we bring our consideration of Caiaphas to a conclusion, when we consider next week, God willing, Caiaphas, his resurrection.